You're very welcome to the Irish Political Roundup with me, Roisin the Cleric.
And me, Paul Brophy. We have a featured interview with Deputy John Paul Phelan TD for Carlow, Kilkenny. We will discover more about the person behind the political profile. Deputy John Paul Phelan has been a Fine Gael TD for Carlow, Kilkenny since the 2011 general election, and he has previously served as Minister of State for local government and electoral reform between 2017 and 2020. He's also served as the Senator on the Labour panel between 2002 and 2011. Before graduating from Waterford Institute of Technology, now called South East Technological University, with an economics and finance degree, he was elected to Kilkenny County Council in 1999 for the Piltown electoral area and become the youngest person to be elected to Kilkenny County Council at the same time. Deputy John Paul Phelan, you're very welcome to Irish Political Roundup.
Thanks very much, Roisin and Paul. I'm delighted to be here.
Deputy Phelan, if we can first go back to the very beginning of your political career, you entered politics while you were still a student at the age of 20, I believe. Am I right?
Yep.
And
a long time ago, Roisin.
Whilst you were still in college, where most students are out partying, and the last thing they're trying to do at the very last moment is get their assignments in before the deadline. And you entered politics. What inspired and motivated you to enter the political world?
Thinking back on it now, in some respects it does seem like a long time ago. In other respects it doesn't. It's hard to credit that it is 23 years ago now. But I was always interested in current affairs, and I was reared in a house that we were actively encouraged by our parents to have our own opinion on everything. And the dinner table genuinely in our house was a place for debate as much as it was for eating. And one thing I'd be eternally grateful to my parents and my siblings for is that there was never any judgment of your opinion. You were allowed to have your own view if you could argue it. And my father, it's gas. My parents had never been involved in politics prior to my becoming involved, but they were involved in everything in the community. I remember my father retiring off of groups when he was in his early 70s, and he was on 19 different committees and voluntary and community organizations, and we were totting it up when he was talking about pulling back from it, and it was a huge part of his life. And it, really, when I was looking for the nomination, I was 19, and people, I don't think very many people gave me a chance of being nominated, never mind being elected. But people were voting for my parents as much as they were voting for me. And thankfully, being from a family, a long extended family, helped. I found that in each of the 9 different Fine Gael branches in South Kilkenny who were nominating people to stand in that election, I had at least a second cousin in each branch in the 9 parishes in the Piltown electoral area, and that was a help. And it was also an eye-opener for me because, as I said, my parents were not directly at all or even indirectly involved in politics. They would have been Fine Gael voters, but having said that, they would have, they would have, I would have thought, at least in certain elections, voted different ways, but as it turned out, I discovered at my father's wake that actually his family in particular were very involved in politics. His father, my grandfather, who was born only 20 years after the famine in 1869. So the generations in my family are huge. My grandfather was in his 40s when he married. My father was in his 40s when he married. I was in my 40s when I married. So there was a huge involvement in politics. So there was that interest in current affairs. I was fascinated as a kid with Gareth Fitzgerald. He was my hero as a small child. And I can actively remember the night the Anglo-Irish Agreement was signed. I was minding my little sister. I was 6, maybe just turned 7. And I can remember him signing it with Peter Barry and Margaret Thatcher and Tom King was the Northern Secretary. I think at the time Douglas Hurd and Dick Spring were in the background. I can see the picture in my mind's eye still. And it kind of, because a huge issue in everyone's house because, you know, you woke up in the morning, you turned on the radio and you go to school, and who had been killed the night before. And here were politicians trying to do something about it. Now, it took another, you know, 12 or 15 years before we got to the Good Friday Agreement and the actual formation of a government in the north. But that stoked my interest. And like the other thing that I inherited from my parents was that interest in community and in involvement. So when the chance came in '99 to stand in the local elections, I wasn't asked by anyone. I asked myself. And I think that's one thing about young people in politics. What I found from the very start is there was a huge number of people who were just more than willing to help and support, because they were delighted to see someone young getting involved in politics and taking an interest. So that's where it all started from. That was a bit long-winded, Roisin, but that's...
Well, that's lovely. And you also said in our last interview that we did with Bobby Elwood that there was a lady, was it June, that was like a second mammy to you? And I was talking to your colleague, Mary Hilda Kavanagh, who's a county councillor here in Kilkenny, and she said that she took you under her wing because you were the same age as one of her children. Yeah, same age as Sarah. And actually, subsequently, when I was in the Senate, myself and Sarah did the King's Inns together and qualified as barristers together. But it's funny, and I mentioned this in that discussion we were having about the late Bobby Elwood. When I got onto the council in Kilkenny, there was in Fine Gael, there was Catherine Connery, Betty Manning was a city councillor, Mary Hilda Kavanagh. In Fianna Fáil, there was Anne Blackmore, Cora Long, Joan Murphy, and Theresa Mullen was an independent. There were 7 councillors in Kilkenny who were female. At the moment, I think it's 3 or 4. And actually, at a point about 10 years ago, the figure of 7 got into double figures, and it's gone backwards since. So that's maybe something we'll talk about a bit later. But I had no shortage of mothers in Kilkenny County Council when I started, and I made some of the best friends I've ever made. I had another birthday this week. I've reached the stage now where I don't talk about birthdays anymore, but I got a couple of messages from my former council mothers during the week, reminiscing as well. And that's something that's really nice, is the friendships that you make along the way. And I suppose, regardless of what political affiliation you are, when you're in the politics in the county council, it does become like a second family. Well, it does, because the council is different. Like the politics comes into it when the budget is being passed and when the chair or the mayor is being elected. Outside of that, each councillor represents an individual electoral area. Mine at the time was Piltown electoral area, which still exists in a shrunken form now. But at that stage, it basically, we drew a line from the bridge in New Ross across to the Tipperary border. Everything south of that, the extreme southern quarter, if you like, of County Kilkenny was the Piltown electoral area. And there was 6 of us elected. And, often the time an issue would arise, where you'd see the 6 councillors from Piltown all on the one side, maybe against their party colleagues who were from the Ballyragget electoral area or whatever. But that was a formidable council. You mentioned Mary Hilda Kavanagh. I mean, she's an extraordinary person. Yeah. She will, everything going grand, be 50 years a councillor at the end of this term, which no woman has ever served in public office in Ireland for 50 years. No one has ever served for 48 years like she is now. So she is unique in that regard. But she was there. You had current and former and indeed future Oireachtas members like Liam Elwood and Bobby Elwood and John McGuinness and Phil Hogan and myself and Dick Dowling. Seamus Patterson couldn't stand because he was the Count Corla, I think, or was about to become Count Corla at that particular stage. And but Joe Cody was representing the Labour Party. But they were formidable people, and that's just mentioning the people who went on or were Oireachtas members. And there were other people who never reached the Oireachtas, but who were very strong local representatives for their own part of County Kilkenny. Many of them served for many, many years. People like Billy Ireland and Dixie Dial, Maurice Shortler. The stories
are out there. And then in 2002, John Paul, you got elected to the Shannon. You know, it's a slightly different system. I get elected to, but that was in 2002. That was on the back of a very, very bad general election for Fine Gael. How did you find? What was it like? You know, making that transition from the county council to the Oireachtas to the Shannon, which is, you know, it can be a very, very different environment to the Dáil that you're currently in.
Well, and what the Shannon then also is openly political, in party political. I mean, the council is obviously openly political, but not less emphasis on the party. But the fact that Fine Gael had such a bad general election was the reason that I got elected to Shannon, because there was an unspoken message amongst all the Fine Gael councillors. You must remember there's 43 senators elected on what are called the vocational panels, who are elected by the outgoing members of the Oireachtas and the sitting county councillors and city councillors. So that makes up an electorate of about 1,150 people. But when you're running, you concentrate on the members of your own party, and you might have personal friendships built up outside of that you also obviously focus on too. But because Fine Gael had done so bad in the general election, the message went out that we need new blood, and I really played into that as hard as I could. I was 23 years of age. I had a little Renault 19, which was actually my twin brother's car. And it was in such bad nick that there was, I had a piece of plywood under my backside because the driver's seat was broken. And it's a fascinating election because you're visiting literally every parish in the country. To get to councillors in all sorts. I remember a man who only died a few months ago, Bernard McGuinness from Culdaff at the top of Inishowen. He has a pub, or had a pub up there. He was Fine Gael councillor for 40 years under Donegal County Council. His son is there now, but he was probably the furthest physically away that I travelled to. I spent a couple of days in the Oireachtas meeting. You know, some of the Oireachtas people who were a lot of them were cynical and were voting for former colleagues who had lost seats in the Dáil election. But I'll never forget, in particular, Simon Coveney and Dennis Nocton, particularly Dennis Nocton, who was so kind and supportive, and anything he could do, he would do, and he did do. Particularly poignant for me because as a young fella involved in Young Fine Gael at the age of about 18, I was at a Young Fine Gael national conference in Waterford in the Tower Hotel when Dennis's father was killed in a head-on collision as he was Cleirigh of the Shannon, Nocturne, former TD, and like 4 of his kids were at that conference when the word came through. And it was just nice that Dennis, completely unprompted, we hadn't known each other in Young Fine Gael, was just so supportive. But I did the tour of the country and I got 37 votes, which I didn't think would be enough. But I was elected to the second last seats on the agriculture panel, the 10th of 11 seats, by a fraction of a vote. I beat the famous late John Bailey, a former chairman of Dublin County Board of the GAA, former long-serving member of Dunleary County Council. Beat him by a fraction of a vote. It was 0.3 of a vote. I beat him by, effectively, it was going to be between me and him for the last Fine Gael seat. There was 4 Fine Gael senators elected. Paddy Burke, who's still in the Shannon, Paul Badford, long-serving TD who had lost his seat, and Ulrich Burke, another long-serving TD who, of course, went on to retain a seat and is still hailing hearty at a good age up in East Galway. And I'd always liked it to be a Southeast or a South Leinster Fine Gael seat on the agricultural panel, and that was what I targeted, and I was lucky enough to get it.
Yeah, and then 2007, you had your first go at a general election.
Yeah. I should actually say, and the question that you asked, Paul, about the transition, I didn't have to transition for a while because I was, for the first year in the Oireachtas, in the Shannon, dual mandate ban hadn't been brought in, so I was still a member of the council. And actually, it's one of the things that I can understand why it happened, and I actually support why it happened. I think that local government should be separate from national government, but it did take strong personalities out of local authorities around the country when the dual mandate ban was brought in. But 2007, as you said, was my first general election. I can remember campaigning very hard. Fine Gael hadn't had a candidate in South Kilkenny since the late Andy Cottrell in 1992. He didn't get on well in 92, but actually in 1989, he was only about 1,500 votes behind Phil Hogan on the first count. Had a very, finished up with a very strong vote. And of course, Andy was, Andy and Dick Dowling in particular of the elected representatives were probably the two ones that were most supportive of me from the get-go. Dick is still with us, hale and hearty, well in his 80s, but still playing the odd round of golf. Thanks be to God. But we lost Andy there a few months ago. But they were instrumental, I suppose, in pushing me forward for the Shannon firstly, and then to go for the general election. I knew myself I had a great chance of winning. I had worked very, very hard. One of the things that's very difficult in Irish politics is establishing your name if you don't come from a political dynasty. And when in that election, the outgoing TDs in Carlow, Kilkenny were Seamus Patterson, Phil Hogan, MJ Nolan, John McGuinness, and Liam Elwood. And all five were the sons. All five were the sons of former politicians. They were not new to the game themselves. So you're trying to break down that. You're trying to establish yourself. I knew I had a good chance. A week before the election, I was summoned to Fine Gael headquarters by the General Secretary, Tom Curran, man who I subsequently became good friends with, and Frank Flannery, who was the Fine Gael Director of Elections nationally, and they told me to pull back, that Fergal Brown had a better chance of winning, and that they produced an opinion poll, which I knew wasn't accurate. And I knew I subsequently investigated and found out that it was completely fabricated. Because one of the sample areas that was chosen was an area, a townland in my own parish. But if you weren't from the area, you wouldn't know where it was, because Brownstown, New Ross, County Wexford. For those listening, it's where the Tullogher Rossburke and GA Club grounds are. So it's very close to New Ross, but very much in County Kilkenny. But whoever was doctoring this poll didn't realise that there's only 9 houses. They were supposed to have done 10 samples. 9 houses in Brownstown. None of them, I was getting no number 1. Now, of the 9 houses in Brownstown at the time, 6 were Fine Gael houses. 3 were members of my own local branch. I rang them all. None of them had been polled by anyone. So I had it straight away, but that didn't, the feeling, I remember driving back from Dublin that night. I knew the campaign was going great and I was going well, but I actually stopped at the car. There was no motorway at the time around Dungarvan, and just got sick on the side of the road because I knew I was being done over effectively by my own. But that didn't stop me. Like I put the pedal to the metal more and probably did myself harm by actually breaking the agreed division of the constituency internally within Fine Gael and canvassing in County Carlow, which was a big no-no. But long-standing councillor, good friend Dennis Foley invited me across, and I did some canvassing. And subsequently, when the election came and Fergal Brown was eliminated, Phil Hogan got the great bulk of his transfers, and I think that may have been down to the fact that I may have annoyed the Carlow Fine Gael membership by breaking the agreement. And on that election, I made the mistake of going right at the morning when the boxes were opened. And I was ahead. I was in the 5th position on the first count and stayed there until the 13th count, where Mary White passed me out. At the 13th count was the last count. And Mary won by a few hundred votes, which was one of the things. It's a sore memory in some respects. My father died a few months later, and he didn't get to see me in the Dáil. But it was also taught me a good lesson about politics and about our system, because I knew, even though I was only passed on the 13th count, I knew in my heart from about the 8th or 9th count that I wasn't going to make it. And you physically can see the ballot papers being moved, and you know there's no one fiddling with it. There's no machine that's given a wrong result. I knew I was being beaten I was in a position to be able to condition myself and condition my supporters, because the count that year was in Thomastown. The tally was actually carried out in my constituency office down on Market Street. It was a joint tally by the three main parties. And I was able to condition everybody to the fact that I just wasn't going to make it. But that didn't make it any easier. But it redoubled my efforts then for the next 5 years or 4 years to make sure that I won the next time.
John Paul, you just mentioned Phil Hogan. Phil Hogan is a big character and personality within politics. Did he give you advice and mentor you through your political career so far?
Well, he did. Like Phil Hogan, behind the scenes, without getting directly involved, was very supportive of me being a candidate in the council election. Because I think, in fairness, Phil Hogan just is a good politician. He realised that I had he did his homework. He knew my connections. He knew the type of person I was, because I got involved in Young Fine Gael in Kilkenny a number of years before, so he knew me for a number of years, and he figured that I could win. And he was very supportive. In fairness, he was supportive when I stood for the Shannon. I remember the first day, I think, or the second day that I went canvassing, he drove me. So my relationship with Phil Hogan has been a very complex one over the years, because there was a feeling by many of my supporters and by myself that in 2007 he was not helpful. But looking back on it now, and with the benefit of hindsight and understanding the way politics works, I suppose Phil Hogan wanted to ensure that he retained his seat, and he wasn't going to see any upstart youngster knock him out. And it would have been, I can understand the logic of it now from this vantage point, that it would have suited him better to have Fergal Brown as the other Fine Gael TD in the constituency in County Carlow, completely separate and different from him. So for a number of years after 2007, our relationship was strained, to say the least. Like my mother, God love her, my mother hates politics and politicians, and always says she preferred me to be breaking stones on the road than be involved in politics. But yet, when it comes to elections, she canvasses around her own area in Inistioge very hard, and I always top the poll in Inistioge, and I put it down to my mammy. But she never really forgave Phil Hogan, because, as I said earlier, my father passed away and didn't see me elected to the Dáil, and my mother took that very badly. But look, I can understand. I didn't understand it at the time, and I was very angry for a very long time. But with the benefit of hindsight now, and actually, my personality is similar enough to Phil Hogan, and we're both political animals, and we both have an involvement in and an understanding of the Fine Gael organisation and what kind of makes the Fine Gael type voter tick. So actually, once Phil went to Brussels, our relationship improved endlessly. It's amazing in politics, Roisin, what a few thousand miles will do for a political relationship.
True. And in 2011, John Paul,
yes,
you made the breakthrough. Of course, Fine Gael did extremely well. They got the 1-3 seats in Carlow, Kilkenny, and then you retained your seat in 2016. And in 2017, you became a Minister of State with responsibility for local government and electoral reform. And a lot of things happened during that time, and even before that time, when we were speaking to your one of your former colleagues, and Phelan, who was the junior minister in between 2014 and 2016. She spoke very highly of you, and she spoke about the great work you did on issues like the boundary down on the Kilkenny Waterford border and St. Columba's Hospital as well.
Yeah. Well, Anne was always a good colleague. I can remember, actually, I didn't serve with Anne. She was elected to the council in the term after me. My sister was on the council with her, and they were good friends. I can remember when she got the Labour nomination, which was a bit of a surprise at the time. I can remember being almost appalled that somebody called Phelan was going to be on the ballot paper, and because her name was Anne, she'd be ahead of me on the ballot paper in 2011. It's gas. But I got to know her then over the following few months very well, and we did, like, I suppose we were both government backbenchers together in that huge majority government that was elected after 2011. And like, we had common interests coming from the same neck of the woods in South Kilkenny. And I never found Anne wanting when it came to sticking her head out, you know, and not necessarily always like in politics. A lot of politicians spend their careers trying to curry favour with the higher ups, so to speak. But Anne was never afraid to say what she thought on political issues, and we did work hard together, particularly on the boundary, because that report came as Anne was a junior minister at the time, and recommended that a huge chunk of South Kilkenny be moved into Waterford, which obviously is an existential crisis for people who are Kilkenny people living on the boundary, but also a huge, like, potentially huge knock-on effects for the rest of the county in terms of the funding of local government in particular, because you'd lose the commercial rates and the property tax from those areas. That would have seen property tax rates going up across the rest of Kilkenny to fill the gap. That's a very kind of monetary way of looking at it, but identity was the big issue. But I can remember you mentioned St. Columba's, like Kathleen Lynch was the junior minister in health who was responsible for older people, and at the time there was a bit of an outcry about some of the public services for geriatric patients for older people around the country, and some of the facilities weren't up to scratch, and the list was drawn up as to which facilities would be replaced, and in other words, the other ones wouldn't be replaced; they'd be just closed. And the original list, St. Columba's wasn't on it, which provoked absolute consternation from me and Anne. And we went to Kathleen, and we fairly laid it on the line with her. And in fairness to Kathleen, she responded. And like Columba's, you both know, and many of your listeners will know, like, Columba's is a fantastic place. Like, it'd do your heart good to visit it and to see the care that's provided, but also like the rehab, the day services. It's obviously a huge impact for Thomastown. Like, it's the biggest employer by far in Thomastown, but also, like, it's just, the setting is perfect for what it provides, as well as the services being up to such a huge standard. And crucially, and this is what probably swung the decision to build a new St. Columba's, is that they had plenty of land to do it. And thankfully it's still on the HSE's priority list for building of new elderly facilities nationally.
Yeah, and it'll be a massive asset when it's built.
Well, look, I mean, I'm just delighted. I've just known so many people who've saw out the last years of their life in such comfort. Like, it's like a home from home. And it's not just comfort, it's just the atmosphere of the place. And I know, like, I know so many of the people who are working and have worked there as well. Like, it's just, it's not like a facility. It is like home.
Absolutely. And when I was talking with Anne, she said, when you get elected to the Dáil and when you're in Dublin, your identity becomes very, very important. And she said it's very important that you deliver for the people that voted for you, because your job is to represent them. Because, like, if you take other parts of the world, be it America or the UK, they take the UK for example. If someone gets elected to Westminster and they're not seen in their constituency till the next election, so you know, it is really important to deliver for the people that you represent. Absolutely,
and but also from the politician's point of view, you get a great kick when you do deliver. You know, when something happens, like I mentioned previously about a very what is an issue that most people in Kilkenny wouldn't have had any understanding of, was the traffic congestion in New Ross prior to the building of the New Ross bypass. Unless they were caught in traffic on some of the evenings. Friday evenings were notorious. Like I one of the things at the time, I remember a number of sad situations where family members couldn't get across the bridge to funeral homes for wakes for people. And at that stage, there was no funeral home in Rossburke, and they were all on the Wexford side. but particularly on a Friday evening, you could be stuck for hours. And at the opening of that was opened during the last election. Ireland's biggest bridge, linking from Wexford across to Glenmore, the bottom of Glenmore Hill. That gave a new lease of life particularly to the local residents on the actual back roads, but also then older people like my own mother, and who have the freedom now to go into New Ross and do their bit of shopping like they would have done all their lives up until the time that the traffic build-up started to happen. And that was something that, again, it was a local issue. The boundary was the other one that really stands out. It was an existential crisis. It drove a wedge, I suppose, between me and Simon Coveney, who I mentioned in positive terms earlier on, because I don't think he understood what he was dealing with in terms of identity. And any people can be very quiet and very laid back, but they know who they're. There's a confidence without arrogance. They're content at being Kilkenny people, and they're fiercely proud of the place. And that goes for the County Kilkenny people talking about Kilkenny City, or city people thinking about County Kilkenny. And often is the case, I think, that where you go to the boundaries of areas, identity becomes stronger. And that's certainly the case. I never forget, in the middle of that boundary dispute, getting a handwritten letter from an elderly bachelor farmer who lived on a back road in Chleirigh. And he explained to me what his identity in this letter. He's a quiet man who probably wouldn't say two words to me if I met him on the street, but he wrote it down, and what it meant to him to be a Kilkenny man, and that he wasn't going to have Simon Coveney or any government making him a Waterford man overnight. And that was another great battle. You can look back on it and enjoy it, but at the time it was fierce.
Absolutely. And as I said, you were a junior minister between 2017 and 2020 in local government, an area that you knew a fair bit about from being elected to the county council at such a young age. What are kind of standouts from that time?
Well, I can remember the day I asked for the job. Actually, it was after the leadership election, and I had been very involved along with 4 or 5 other people, in getting Leo Varadkar elected as leader of Fine Gael. And he asked me which job I wanted, and I said I wanted local government and electoral reform. And I wanted local government because there was 4 or 5 things I wanted to do. I wanted to reverse some of the changes that had happened 4 or 5 years previously with the boundaries for local electoral areas. The ridiculous situation that saw Kilkenny City split in two, and one of the areas going down as far as the ferry bridge on the other side of New Ross, the east area and the west area going out, and including Callan, as well as a lot of the rural end. So the re-establishment of areas based on urban centres and the hinterland, the natural hinterland of urban centres, the reduction in size. Like some of the local electoral areas were bigger than counties. There was one in southwest Cork that stretched from just outside of Kinsale all the way to the Kerry border, 120 miles of an electoral area electing 10 councillors, where people couldn't possibly know their local councillor. The other thing that was, I suppose, uppermost on my mind, I wanted to do an analysis of the role of councillor. And we took on a woman called Sarah Moorhead, senior counsel, who I had seen in action in a previous life, as she was brought in at the last minute to salvage the banking inquiry, and was quite outstanding. One of the most incisive minds I'd ever dealt with in politics. And she did a report and an analysis of what a councillor does, and looked at the remuneration of councillors, but also the time that's put in, whether the role should be a full-time one or not. So that was completed. Sadly, I didn't get the support of government to implement it. It was implemented by the current minister, Peter Burke. The other one that stands out was there was 2 other ones. One was the directly elected mayors. We had the plebiscite in Limerick. Like, I firmly believe that each local authority in the country should have a directly elected chairperson, whether that's a mayor or a chair, whatever they choose their own title. Because despite the fact that, for the most part, our structure of local government has served us pretty well, and the management systems work well by and large across the country. There's a democratic deficit, to use a cliche, in terms of how decisions are reached and how so few powers are reserved for councillors, and so much power is wielded by unelected people. At least if you have the opportunity of directly electing your own local government, you can influence the way and the policy decisions that local government takes. So the passing of the plebiscite in Limerick, it failed narrowly, like a few hundred votes in Cork. It failed by more in Waterford, but at least we got one over the line, which we were afraid when the campaign started we wouldn't. And thankfully now that legislation is actually on the priority list for the Oireachtas, so that we will have a directly elected mayor in Limerick when the next local elections happen. The other one was the introduction and the reform of the electoral register, which is an issue that has now been left to the newly established Electoral Commission, which again was a piece of legislation that I got off the ground, but that my successor in that half of the department, Malcolm Noonan, saw over the line, and to ensure that the electoral register is accurate, and that this awful situation which still exists where people who might be dead for 10 years are still on the electoral register. Like, it's very hurtful for particularly surviving partners if the polling card arrives, a few days before the election with their dead partner's name on it, like in some cases years after they passed away, and in many cases after several attempts by their family to have them removed from the electoral register, they're still on it. So that situation, and the automatic removal of people once they pass away, or indeed once they move, but also then the automatic registration of people once they reach 18, because the PPS system, being part of the Department of Social Protection, they have dates of birth, and they can, have people almost pre-registered once they turn 18, that they will be on the register and they won't be disappointed when they show up in a polling station looking for a vote.
Absolutely. And another issue that kind of came up during your time as a minister was the MRI in St. Luke's. That in 2016, I think it was, the machine was agreed to have it, but it was kind of sitting in a warehouse, for want of another word. And I know from talking to people, you work very, very hard with Simon Harris to ensure that that MRI unit in St. Luke's is now properly staffed, and so as to allow people access to the MRI scanner.
Well, it was something that I just, again, you see, from a Kilkenny point of view, by the way, Kilkenny is divided health-wise, in the sense that if you're from Ballyhale, you might go to St. Luke's, or you might go to Arkeen or Waterford University Hospital, as it is now. So, my own home base is in the Waterford University Hospital area, really. But I was dumbstruck when the first time that Gary Courtney put it to me that this is the 10th biggest hospital in the country by numbers in terms of people treated, St. Luke's, and it didn't have an MRI scanner. And you have much smaller hospitals with two of them. So look, it had to be brought to a political head, and you're right, there was a commitment given in 2016, and it sat in the warehouse for a number of years. But thankfully, look, I know Simon Harris since he was about 15, and he used to be at Fine Gael meetings in a little suit, and he was a young fella. Right. And he's very close friends, and his wife indeed with my own wife. I remember bringing him down to Kilkenny, and he gave a commitment at St. Luke's. Now, again, like everything, it didn't happen overnight, but he did deliver. And more than that, then he delivered the most recent extension as well, which includes the MRI scanner, but also the 70 plus beds. And now Mr. Courtney and his management team are pushing ahead, as they have to do for hopefully for the next extension, which they're looking for twice as big again. But the initial decision by James Riley, actually, as Minister for Health in that 2011 government, to build the new A&E in St. Luke's, that will go down in history as the decision that was taken that will ensure that we will have a hospital an operating, fully functional, all services provided hospital in Kilkenny for as long as we're around, and hopefully longer. Because if that extension, if that new A&E had to have happened, I know what had happened in the HSE, and I have my suspicions as to why the scanner sat since 16 in a warehouse. And it's all to do with the structures and management of the hospital group that Kilkenny and St. Luke's were in, who were ensuring that, well, shall we say that services were and equipment was provided quicker to other hospitals than it was to St. Luke's.
And John Paul, you were very, you worked very hard in pushing the Susie Long ward over the line as well.
Well, it's it's not funny, it's tragic. Like I can remember I was listening to Susie Long on the Joe Duffy show when the story broke nationally. And I think I only met her once, but it was one of those stories that really touched the nation, never mind Kilkenny and Carlow. And like there was, again, goes back to that Kilkenny attitude to things. There was a real resolve by a lot of people and a very dedicated group in the hospice group to that her death would not be in vain. You know, that we would have our own palliative care facilities in Kilkenny. And like I've been involved for a number of years now with the group and indeed with the management of the hospital to try to ensure that we do have proper end-of-life treatment and facilities available in Kilkenny. But even more than that, when you go back to things like the scanner, which we mentioned earlier on, we all know that the real tragedy of Susie Long is that her death needn't have happened. But because she was not, her cancer wasn't found quickly enough, it became inevitable, but it needn't have. And it's one thing that I've always found, and I found myself in the last couple of years with my own health issues, that once you get into the health service in Ireland, once you're on the radar, I'm in the happy situation now, having had a heart attack, that I'm on the radar of brilliant professionals. But if you're not on that radar, it can still be a very, very difficult place to be. And hopefully, with new facilities, extra services provided in St. Luke's, hopefully we can avoid future Susie Long situations, but also if people then are coming near the end of their lives, that they'll have the dignity that they need and their families need to cope with that situation.
And you were also very, very proactive in the sporting world here in Kilkenny with the GAA. Yeah,
well, it's funny actually. It's only in the last year I've been elected as the vice chairman of my own club, Tullogher Ross Perkins. But like I was involved, I was on the committee of the club before I was elected to the council many years ago now, as I said, 23 years ago. I did a lot of hurling as a young man. I injured my back playing rugby when I was 23. Around the time I was elected to Shannon, that was the end of my sporting career. I was one of those people up until I was about 23. I used to train every day of the week. And again, it goes back to community. Like in Kilkenny, the GA club is the centre of every parish. And my own one, no different. And I've always, like my late father spent 30 years as either the chairman or secretary of Tullogher Ross Perkins GA Club. So, and one of my brothers has been chairman, the other one was secretary for many years. So, it goes very deep. My mother remains the only person in our household who ever hurled in Crow Park, though. And my sister as a Leinster minor medal with Kilkenny back, say when she was a minor, but it's a few years ago now. But I did a lot of hurling with Good Council in New Ross as well, where most of the students from my part of Kilkenny would go to school in the secondary schools in New Ross. But I brought that then, I suppose, into politics in terms of the sports capital program and the sports capital grants. You don't always have success. And I can remember one very prominent big club in South Kilkenny that 3 years in a row were refused a grant. But there was a problem with the title of the land. That system was changed a number of years ago. Now you can have a leasehold, but so much money has been invested, and sports clubs, in particular the GAA, but also soccer in Kilkenny and obviously camogie, women's Gaelic football. Like my nieces are mad Gaelic footballers, literally mad ones. But they're really good, and like those facilities, we have facilities in every, like the first match I ever played, Henry Shefflin played the match as well. We were playing Tullogher against the Shamrock Primary School, and I can remember togging out under a bush in the old Friary pitch, which subsequently became a soccer pitch, I think, in October. And like no club in Kilkenny now does anyone tog out under a bush. And that's just, I mean, that's obviously hugely positive, but it's because of massive investment and massive organisation by local groups, local clubs themselves, to get the applications in, to have the structures in place that we can have. We have really good sporting organisations across Kilkenny with really good facilities, and it can only happen once you have that dedicated local core of people. And that's what I was reared with. Like I'd say I spent every night of the week as a child in the local hurling pitch when my father was the chairman of the club. Like in those days, it was before we had a landline, never mind a mobile phone. And my father was a bit like myself. He'd always be 5 minutes late for everything. And we had a very prominent man who went on to be chairman of the county board in Kilkenny, John Healy, famously the man who gave the job to Brian Cody as manager of the Kilkenny hurling senior hurling team. But John was very punctual, and I can remember as a child arriving in the pitch and he'd always be pointing at his watch as my father drove in on 2 wheels at the last minute. Well, actually not well past the last minute usually. But yes, sports always big part of my life, and will remain so. I look forward to getting more involved in Tullogher, Rossparkin again in the next year.
And you're going quite well in the junior championship.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how things pan out
We're playing Wine Gap, the real southern derby on Saturday.
Yeah, there'll be plenty of blood and thunder there. John Paul as well, kind of going back to kind of the constituency stuff as well. Education, is extremely important, and health as well, because you think about it, they're the two services that we will all use at some point in our lives as well. And we're talking there off air that the new school in Ferrybank it's the biggest school in Kilkenny. It's got like over 1,000 pupils, and there's a new health centre gone into Ferrybank as well. So that's an area that's exploding.
Again, like most people in Kilkenny, if they thought about it, they might realise it, but most people don't realise that Ferrybank is the second biggest town in Kilkenny by a distance. Like there's 6,000 or 7,000 people living there now, and will be more. But it's also got a huge hinterland into the south county, and the Abbey Community College in Ferrybank, well over 1,000 students now. Like the entire school is new. When I say new, it's been built in my time in national politics, and like it's one of the best schools in the country, never mind in County Kilkenny. But that was important for a growing local area like Ferrybank, which seen this massive increase in population. But it's also reflective of, like, you go into the parishes around Ferrybank, Piltown parish, 4,500 people, Monkine parish, 3,500 to 4,000. Kilmacow parish, I'd say, has 4,000. Steveroo is a smaller geographic area, but it's quite densely populated as well. And those are the immediate South Kilkenny parishes next to Waterford. So I was obviously keen then to ensure that other services would come. Simon Coney, one of the things he did, I suppose, in response to the boundary issue at the time, when the LIHAF scheme was introduced where national government would fund projects that would support the development of housing, he gave 2 grants to Kilkenny. One was to what I still call the circular road, the road linking from the Callan Road across to the Ballycallan Road, which is opening up new sites for development, some of which are being constructed at the moment, where there'll be 2 new schools built on that particular stretch of road, a new Carlow to Pobble Bus-Rí and a new Kilkenny City Vocational School. And in Ferrybank, we have a town park for Ferrybank, which in fairness was partly funded by Waterford City Council as well as Kilkenny County Council, but is hugely used and a real central cog in the community development in Ferrybank. The other thing you mentioned in education, just the commitment by the Department of Education in Joe McHugh's time to that Kilkenny CBS would get a new school development, which is I suppose in different stages of planning at the moment on the back of the Festival Road, if you like. But the existing CBS site was designed for a couple of hundred students, and now you have a school that hopes to go.
It was a tight squeeze in there.
Yes, well, exactly, and like now it's a school that can go to 800 or more students on that new site, hopefully. The other one you mentioned, health. Ferrybank Health Centre, more or less fully operational at the moment. And also the one in Thomastown, which is a great boost for the town. Again, you mentioned St. Columba's earlier on. There's always been a good GP service in Thomastown as well, and the age in which we live in now, to reduce pressure on acute hospitals like St. Luke's, we need better, more up-to-date, fully modernised equipment and facilities like the new health centre in Thomastown. And even like little over a week ago, we had Minister Harris again in Thomastown to give over €1 million for the Grennan Equestrian Centre, which was opened the year I was born in 1978, and still has prefabs and still operating out of the same buildings. But thankfully, they have the site, and that allowed the minister then to come in with this investment for what is a fantastic educational provider for students for 40 years, more than 40 years across not just Kilkenny but further afield. Like I can remember as a young fella, I'm connected by marriage to the former Tipperary hurler and manager Declan Ryan, and I remember he was a student in the Equestrian Centre in Thomastown many years ago now. So that it was good to see that facility finally getting a commitment of funding. I'd like to, certainly before the end of this government term, see a commitment in terms of a footprint for a university campus for Kilkenny City. And at the moment, the ETB, Carlow Kilkenny ETB, have a proposal in with the Minister Harris's department for the St. Patrick's site on the Kells Road for an apprenticeship hub, if you like, for the two counties. And I would hope in time that that site is a 20-acre site, and I think it would be suitable for other. The ETB won't need the full 20 acres for the apprenticeship hub. That might be a potential site for where part of the University of the Southeast might have some campus and provide some courses and permanent students based in Kilkenny City.
Yeah, that all sounds really promising, and hopefully that will happen in due course. So I say you got plenty. You said you're in politics. You're elected politics since 1999. Is there anything else you'd like to see happen in your political lifetime? Let's say.
I'm really looking forward, and again, it goes back to my own health situation. I'm supposed to take up cycling, and one of the things myself and my wife Claire were living until very recently in Ferrybank for 10 years. We just moved back to my mother's house, my home house in Tullogher, which, if people don't know it, it's under the wind turbines outside of Munlamat, but where I come from originally. But the development of the Greenway from Waterford City to New Ross has real potential. Real potential. I'm really looking forward to the potential for the town of New Ross itself, which is a beautifully situated town, but has been economically depressed. There's no two ways of putting it. And like I think that the Greenway itself, like people are already very impressed with the Waterford Greenway and the scenery and the views. Will be blown away by parts of the South Kilkenny Greenway because it travels up the Barrow Valley. And there's a loop around the back of New Ross, which goes over what we call the Red Bridge, which is Joe Welch's farm, Walter the Hurler's uncle's farm across to Mount Garrett. And I think there's a viewing of where the Barrow and the Nore meet, which is just north of New Ross. It has the potential to open up the town economically, but it also has potential to be a stunning amenity. And for people like me who need to do a lot of exercise, it because it's in the river valley, it's relatively flat, so we'll be able to cycle it quite easily. And I'm looking forward to that happening. Parts of it actually might even be open before the end of this year, if not early next year.
And Deputy Phelan, you were also involved in the New Ross bypass. We can't let you go without talking about the New Ross bypass.
Well, that was opened just during the general election campaign in 2020, in January. And again, like because New Ross is my local town growing up and where I went to school, and because I know everyone who lives on every back road on the way into New Ross, I knew that people were effectively prisoners in their own homes for 2 hours every evening. And it was very serious in terms of personal issues, like I mentioned earlier on, family funerals, people not being able to get to them, medical appointments. You know, if the emergency services had to get to a house, there was 1 or 2 incidents that did happen, but also then just the general comfort of going about your daily life and not living in fear that you might get caught in a 2-hour tailback to travel a journey that should take less than 5 minutes. Yeah. So like it is spectacular as well, and I'm sure many of your listeners have been over the bridge. The sides are a bit high. I can see it, but my wife can't really see out over the edge. But it is the highest and biggest bridge in the country, and like watching it being constructed, my father's uncle lived in a place called the Pink Rock, which is between Glenmore and Tullogher, Shambo. And actually his first cousin died just during the construction of the bridge. Neddy Phelan, I used to be down a bit and watching the bridge being constructed as it was from the centre of the river. It was spectacular, but it has opened up. It has opened up opportunities for the town of New Ross, which I think that the Greenway might be able to capitalise upon. If you look at what has happened in Waterford with villages that were very, very dead almost, like Kilmacthomas, which is now, got so many small little businesses that have opened up because of the passing traffic of people on bicycles or people walking the Greenway. And I really think that New Ross, because of the situation, which is quite pretty, could benefit immensely from the potential that the Greenway offers.
Yeah, sounds fantastic.
Well, Deputy Phelan, we phoned a good few of your colleagues over the last couple of days when we knew we were interviewing. And Paul, Frances O'Halloran, she had a lot of lovely things to say about her boss, John Paul Phelan.
Absolutely, she said you're a very understanding and very good boss, and she said you were extremely hard worker, and you'd always work for people and try help them where you could. So she was full of praise for you, and she said there had many good times, particularly celebrating election success.
Yes, in Paddy Ryan's and Lister Lynn. There was one famous night. I don't know, was it the last election or the one before, where Paddy was doing some renovations, and I always end my speeches on election celebrations with Rip Tullogher, which is a very old thing that goes back over 100 years, when Tullogher were playing a football match against Glenmore, and a cousin of my own, Nick Roach, was a great Tullogher footballer, but he had a little truck, and the entire team arrived on a truck And the Glenmore Wise boys stuck on R.I.P. Tullaher on the truck, and Luke's speech was, "We'll give him Rip Tullaher." But I gave him Rip Tullaher, and I put my fist through the ceiling of Paddy Ryan's pub in Listerlin, which I made up for later with Paddy. That was one of them. We've had many celebrations there, thankfully, over the years. But Francis O'Hanrahan was Francis Prendergast originally. Her father was a great hurler, Peter Prendergast, famously on that team in 1947 that won that great, what many people consider the best All-Ireland hurling final of all time. But without Fran, like, any politician is only as good as the people who work for them. And I've had very good people over the years. Fran, Pat Dunphy, Mary Ronan, Liam Keane, Nancy McSweeney. The other thing that's happened to me, I suppose, in the last few years is that I finally got off the pot and got married. And I'm very lucky. My wife Claire comes from an even stronger Fine Gael pedigree than myself, from Leitrim. My father was a councillor for many years in Dromahare, and thankfully, because of the nature of the job, it's such a huge benefit to have a partner who understands what the job involves, understands the fact that it might mean you're gone the whole time, or gone nearly every night of the week, and also crucially then also understands what elections are about. And actually, Claire loves the campaign and is a really good canvasser. I suppose her father's first election happened when she was 3, so she's literally been campaigning since then. So that I didn't have Claire, I didn't have the people who work with me, my own family, and those are the core. And there's about I remember when I stood in 11, I had 100 and something volunteers that campaigned with me. We've the famous picture still, which I get very nostalgic when I look at it, because so many of them have passed away, even young people, in the New Park Hotel in Kilkenny. Hogan told me afterwards he knew I was going to be elected when he saw that picture.
It comes back in, we can finish it off. Maybe his phone or something died.
Yeah, it looked like he was doing it on the phone.
I'm gonna put Percy out. Did you hear Percy meowing? Did you?
Yeah.
He's great crack, Paul.
Oh yeah.
We'll wait and see if he comes back on, because we want to end it.
Absolutely, yeah. Punching a hole in the roof.
I say he's great crack.
Yeah. Yeah, he sounds.
I'm gonna pause recording, see if he comes back.
Yeah.
Remind me when he comes back to put it on.
Mm-hmm.
Where is record, Paul? I can't find. Where is record?
I don't know. There's a little red light here in the corner saying it's recording. My corner, in my left hand.
Whiteboard.
Yeah.
Oh, pause recording.
Okay.
John Paul, we can't end this interview without telling you what Mary Hilda Kavanagh, your colleague in the County Council and the longest reigning, as we said at the intro of the interview, County Councillor in Ireland. And I would say one of the most respected county councillors in politics here in Ireland as well. I asked her about it. She said, she took, as we said earlier, she took you under her wing as you were like one of her own children and also the same age. You are very charming, very respectful, with a good heart, and your heart is always in the right place. You are a very good person, but like many other politicians, you have stealing within you, and we need that as a country. We need men like you. Ambitious but very humble, not remotely pushy, and eager to learn from others who've gone before you. She said you're very good at consulting other people and very approachable. You always attend the local county meetings. You listen to everyone's point of view, and you respect every county councillors, and you respect that county councillors reflect locally how people in your constituency are thinking and feeling. You're a decent human being, and And she said, we then talked about what a decent human being was and meant to the two of us. And then we came up with this description. A decent human being is a person with a person, especially a politician, with personal and political integrity, with decency and honor. She said, and then she said, you're a farmer's son who comes from a very respectable family.
My mother would be delighted with all of that. I am too. I am too. No, and Mary Hilda's a force to be reckoned with. Like, she's just one. What she said there is crucially important. An awful lot of national politicians don't know. I won't name the government minister, but our government minister a number of months ago told us that we should talk to our councillors and the people who work in our offices to find out what's going on. Like, I nearly erupted at that meeting because, like, I talk to my county councillors and the people who work for me every day of the week, several times a day usually. It just struck me as so weird that someone in a prominent position, not the leader of my party or anything now, but a prominent, well-known politician would think that this was groundbreaking. Like, I'd never have gotten anywhere if I didn't listen to the people who, like, campaign with me, the people who are active on the ground. Like that first election that I was successful in, that picture of 150 people where Phil Hogan said, I knew you were going to be elected. I was given 4 days to canvass Kilkenny City and I had it done in a day and a half because so many people turned up and the enthusiasm was so good. So look, if you didn't do that, but then on the other hand, I would never have been anything in politics if I didn't have great support. I mentioned my own family and people who directly work in my office, but there's a network of people across Carlow and Kilkenny. Some of them are involved in Fine Gael, some of them aren't, who've always helped me, but always, told me what's going on and, what the story is locally on whatever issue that's topical, or, just a general call to say, well, for instance, we're living in this energy crisis now and cost of living crisis. Like, long before it had reached kind of the upper echelons of politics in the country, I was getting those calls from that core of people. Some of them, like Mary Hilda Kavanagh, who live every day of their lives listening to people and communicating with people, and therefore know what's really affecting people often before the senior politicians or the senior public servants or civil servants realise what the real issues are.
Well, definitely, John Paul Phelan, with praise and admiration from such a distinguished lady like Mary Hilda Kavanagh, you can't go wrong in that. And I say your mommy would be very proud.
Yeah, well, I'm proud myself. Like, I think it's important in life to be respectful. Like, I love discussion. It goes back to where it all started for me, Roisin. I love people with different views. I just bring it on. I want to have a discussion and an argument. And sometimes I will be persuaded. Sometimes I might persuade them. But I love people who have strong opinions and are prepared to back them up, and not just have a soundbite. And I think if you're going into politics, you have to be. It's a good way to be able to listen to people and make up your own mind.
Exactly. Well, Deputy John Paul Phelan, thanks a million for taking the time to chat to us. It was very, very interesting, very, very insightful, and I think we definitely got to see the person behind the political profile. And I would like to say thanks for taking the time to speak to us, and we wish you every success into the future.
Thanks very much, Paul and Roisin, for having me. I was delighted to be asked, and I enjoyed it too.
Thank you so much indeed. That's all for this episode, folks. And Paul, we'll be back next week.
We sure will. And thanks for tuning in.